Sometimes the media is like the Tower of Babel or Babel, depending how you pronounce it. Do you know that story? It's biblical. Basically, these people were trying to build a tower that would go all the way up to the heavens, and God was like, no. So he had them suddenly speak different languages so they couldn't work together. There is such an important lesson in that idea. In the news, that kind of confusion takes place all the time, but people don't realize it because they're using the same word, but they have very different meanings for that word. So they're literally not talking about the same thing. This problem has been rampant recently in some of the biggest, most contentious issues. It also came up at an event that I just did. One of the first questions I was asked was about how the media defines its terms. The head of a group had had a disagreement with the head of the biggest newspaper in her city.
When we pressed them on where that definition came from, they told us, well, it's from Webster's.
You'll hear more of that ahead. Today, on They Stand Corrected, I'm digging into 3 terms in the news to show you how this problem happens and how it can lead to all sorts of journalistic failures. Those 3 words are transgenderism, feminism, and Zionism. You'll see that news organizations claim to have a rule, but they really only follow that rule when they want to. You'll also hear from a hilarious comedian, Bill Burr. He had this contentious exchange with public radio host Terry Gross, and I will explain why this relates to something that so many people have been asking me about lately, the debate that I won at Oxford. Meanwhile, lots of you have been asking me about the case of this one pro-terror activist whom the Trump administration wants to deport. He's not a citizen, but there is a lot of talk about his First Amendment rights. So much to say about that and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello and welcome. Great to have you here. My name is Josh Lebs, and this is my podcast, They Stand Corrected, which fact-checks the news. For those of you who don't know, I spent 20 years in mainstream media, 10 on NPR, 10 on CNN, where I became the lead on-air fact-checker. I saw back then, and continues to be true to today, that so much reporting would not pass basic fact-checking. This is a huge problem, and it's damaging our society. So this show shows you what the news is getting wrong and the systemic problems behind those failures so that we can fix them together. With each episode, I send out a newsletter, usually more than one, packed with links and images and more information. I don't expect you to take my word for anything. I also will be explaining during this show that there are 2 great ways to get in touch with me. I love hearing from people with your feedback, and that very often is what leads me to these topics. The first place I check is the newsletter, and while the newsletter is free, I encourage you to get it. Paid subscribers to the newsletter get additional exclusive content. For example, I show you how to access just about any news article for free, legally, with no paywalls. And paid subscribers are able to message me directly. That is the first place I check for topics to cover. That clip you heard at the top, the question I was asked about the definition of a word, that was not about the first word I'm going to tackle here today. And there's a reason for this. There's a method to it. Stick with me and you will see why. Recently, White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt was discussing some of the government funding that Trump has been freezing. Here's something she said.
It means no more funding for the Green New scam that has cost American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars. It means no more funding for transgenderism and wokeness across our federal bureaucracy and agencies.
That term, transgenderism, has become very controversial and problematic in recent years. News agencies have pretty much been avoiding it unless they're attributing it. Here was a report on CNN about the conservative firebrand Michael Knowles and a protest at the University of Pittsburgh.
Knowles is most famous for this one line in his speech at CPAC this year.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
And he was brought to Pitt by a conservative group to debate whether the government should regulate what the group calls transgenderism.
There is an organization called GLAAD that focuses on different groups under the umbrella of LGBTQ+. The organization says that the current use of the term transgenderism arises from anti-trans extremists who seek to delegitimize and dehumanize trans people by implying that being trans is an ideology rather than an identity. GLAAD links to a page about this over at the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. They have the best summary I've seen of what's going on with this term. The ADL says, originally an academic term for the phenomena of gender dysphoria, the term transgenderism has been co-opted by anti-trans activists. Hearing all this, you think, okay, then it makes sense that the media might be avoiding this term. But remember that clip I played for you at the top about how the media says, well, we go by Webster's dictionary. Well, guess what word is in Webster's?
Transgenderism.
Actually, it's there twice under definition and medical definition. In Webster's, it's just the noun for being transgender, kind of like how homosexuality is listed as a noun for the adjective homosexual. Think about how these very different meanings affect the way that any news consumer interprets news stories. To some people, eradicating transgenderism is like saying eradicating homosexuality. Throughout time, and this is a fact, there have always been people who don't fit neatly into binary gender patterns, not just physically in ways that scientists can recognize, but also in terms of how they live their lives. But to other people, banning transgenderism is about getting rid of an ideology in which you teach people or children certain things. Anytime someone uses it, the media should stop and say what it is they're talking about. This has practical ramifications everywhere. I reported on this show about changes taking place at Meta, which includes Facebook. They have dropped some of their rules about what is allowed on their platforms. Their new rules specifically talk about this. Under hateful conduct, they say, do not post content targeting people on the basis of protected characteristics like mental capacity and mental illness. But these rules also say, we do allow allegations of mental illness or abnormality when based on gender or sexual orientation, given political and religious discourse about transgenderism and homosexuality. So under these rules, you can't diss people about mental illness, but you can if you say it's because of transgenderism. Private companies like Meta are going to do whatever they're going to do. Government officials will do whatever they're going to do. The media should be providing clarity. It is not hard to state that there have always been people who would today be described as trans, totally outside of any ideology. And it's not hard to ask people when they use the term exactly which thing they mean by it. Until then, we've got some Tower of Babel stuff going on. We just don't realize it. But there's an important rule here that I want us to focus on. The media is not simply going with the dictionary on this. Even though it's in the dictionary, in Webster's, not listed as a horrible thing, they're still generally avoiding it. That brings us to another term.
President Donald Trump is the most feminist president, certainly of my lifetime.
That's Fox News, of course. In this case, talking about keeping biological males out of women's sports.
Republicans didn't ask to take up this fight for feminism, but it's one that we will fight happily. This will be the next wave of true feminism, fighting for women's sports, women's spaces, and the integrity of those sports and those spaces.
Trump is not some big feminist. See how he has always treated women. He was also found guilty of sexual abuse in the E. Jean Carroll case, and the judge in that case said the jury found him guilty of what people understand to be rape. His treatment of Hillary Clinton alone was so openly sexist. It was like he was trying to be a sexist stereotype. Even women I know who voted for him say he's sexist, and there's a lot about him that they can't stand, and they would not want to deal with him or have their daughters deal with him personally. But they think that Republicans are doing better on some big issues. These women on Fox could see protecting women's sports as a feminist cause. When you hear the word feminism, what do you think of? There was such an interesting back and forth about this just the other day between comedian Bill Burr and Terry Gross, host of the public radio show Fresh Air. She played part of his stand-up special in which he joked about feminism being doomed to fail.
Because they still need men's help to make it happen. I don't understand why women just can't work with each other. But they keep coming to us like, you more men need to care about this issue. Where are the men to stand up and say something? Like, why do I have to say something? This is your problem.
Here's Terry.
I think that is really funny if you're coming from the perspective of
of course men have to be involved, because the whole point of feminism is becoming equal and getting men who perceive women as less than, or as incompetent or stupid, or any of the patronizing things or insulting things, misogynist things that men may think.
It was really interesting. Here's a little piece of what he said.
I'm making a point. I'm also being playful, but I'm also not going to be this person just going like, yes, you are 100% right, because you are a woman and you are not flawed at all, and you are not abusive, and you are not responsible at all for where you are in life. If you're not where you want to be in life, it's because of men. I don't subscribe to that any more than I subscribe to, hey, these dumb broads need to be home making me a sandwich. I'm not that guy either.
When I heard this, I kept thinking about how they were, in some ways, talking past each other because of different understandings of feminism. I came at this in an unusual way. When I was writing my book, All In, it was about the truth about dads, modern fatherhood. It's the kind of thing that I had talked about on the air, on CNN. I had done all these fact checks about dads, and then had a battle over gender equality in paid leave. My agent at the time, a woman, told me it was going to be a feminist book. I was like, it is? I didn't know that. And then one of the publishers, who's a woman, she said it's a feminist book. I still didn't give that a lot of thought until the book came out and the Financial Times listed me as one of the top male feminists in the world. These days, there's all these jokes about male feminists, this stereotype of someone calling themselves a male feminist while being sexist. I never pursued that term. But once that list came out, I was invited to do a bunch of events at Oxford, including this debate on feminism. I did what I do. I went and looked it up. I'll post the video online of the talk that I gave at the debate, and we won. Yay. And I began with the dictionary. I said, we're here at Oxford. Let's go by the Oxford English Dictionary. I checked it again for you today. The definition is advocacy of equality of the sexes and the establishment of the political, social, and economic rights of the female sex. It's about equality. I have met people, men and women, who think that feminism is some bad thing, some sort of anti-male thing. But by definition, if someone were to be anti-male, they would not be feminist. See how that works? Because someone who is, under this definition, has to believe in and push for actual equality, not sameness, equality. When people talk about feminist causes and feminism, I often see people talking past each other because they have not hit the nail on the head about what they're talking about. That is Tower of Babel stuff. Oh, and by the way, as I mentioned earlier, I have seen it pronounced Babel online, but this does come from the Bible. So I went back and checked the original Hebrew, which says Bavel. So there. If you're screaming at me into your phone or car radio, it's Babel. Well, not originally, but I don't mind. Pronounce it however you want. Anyway, here's where things get trickier. There is a very different way to look at what the word feminism refers to. And that leads us directly into the biggest problem with how the media handles the word Zionism. That's coming up.
This is an absolutely amazing podcast. Josh Levs is a treasure and a wonderful source of information.
I just wanted to thank you for They Stand Corrected. It's just fantastic. Thank you for these tools and for your incredible work here.
If you are not listening to They Stand Corrected weekly, then you are doing yourself a disservice. Never before has a podcast like this been so necessary. Josh, keep up the good work.
I absolutely love your podcast.
I love what you're doing to prevent the democracy demolition of 24/7 toxic disinformation.
It's a highlight of my week every time it comes out because I know I'm going to learn something. You have made me a much more educated consumer of news.
Thank you so much to everyone sending in messages like this. To find out how you can do the same, get in touch. There's a form that's free and available to anyone to fill out. It's linked in the show notes. Are you familiar with Lysistrata? It's this classic Greek play about women deciding to withhold sex until men end the war. There are lots of treatises about how it is a feminist play. And that makes sense. It's about women finding a way to have a voice in society in making determinations about what the society does and does not do. Lysistrata has come up in the news lately. because of this thing called 4B. It's a phenomenon out of South Korea in which women are swearing off heterosexual dating and sex, and it's something that has gotten more attention and popularity since the 2024 election in which Trump won. Here is a clip from ABC in which they speak with Jiwoon Lee, an assistant professor at Syracuse University.
South Korean feminists were genuinely quite surprised by this hype about phobia in the US. I consider it as online-based popular kind of a sentiment at best.
PBS has a piece about this also. It's up at their website, and they specifically cite Lysistrata. They talk about feminism. There's also a movie from Spike Lee, I believe, called Chirac that was similar to Lysistrata. Anyway, the fact that Lysistrata is seen as feminist is super important for how that word is used as a belief in gender equality. If you Google, when did feminism begin? Do you know what answer you get? 1848. So right there we have a problem. If Lysistrata was feminist, how did feminism begin in 1848? This is where we get into language. When some people use the term feminism, they're literally talking about the actual word itself. And that, of course, is a whole different concept because throughout time in other cultures, people didn't speak English. So, of course, they weren't using that exact word. That brings us to Zionism. I'm going to pause here for a moment to help people through this. Over the years, the mainstream media has carried water for a hate movement that has given people a false idea of what this term means. To understand clearly here, we have to go through what can be a tricky mental process of trying really hard to set aside our emotions and our subconscious responses to stuff. I've said this before, to think like a rational alien that just got to Earth and is looking at humanity. With our minds kind of cleared like that, here is a question that I was asked at an event recently. I spoke in Albany, New York, actually my hometown. It was packed. They had to establish an overflow room. It was such a great experience, and I'm so glad so many people care about facts. This event was organized by a group called Amida Albany. After my talk, we did some Q&A. The group's co-founder, Laura Weisblatt, explained that she had a back and forth with the editor-in-chief of the local paper, which is called the Times-Union.
The way that the paper defined Zionism was a Jewish nationalist movement born in the 19th century that supports the maintaining of a Jewish national state in what was once Palestine. When we pressed them on where that definition came from, they told us, well, it's from Webster's. When we expressed our dismay at that definition being used and tried to tell them what we defined Zionism to be, they doubled down. So can you speak to the definition of Zionism and how the media has obscured its meaning?
Yeah. And by the way, it was once Palestine because the Romans tried to erase Jewish identity and named it after the Philistines. They've never bothered to learn basics.
You know how I just said feminism is about gender equality, but you can also find that it started in the 1800s? We are dealing with a similar split here. That split has been weaponized by hate groups. Here's the deal. To me and millions of people around the world, Zionism is just the current English language term for something that has existed literally for millennia. Earlier, I mentioned the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL. So let's take a look at how they define it. Actually, they put this beautifully. Zionism is the movement for self-determination and statehood for the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland, the land of Israel. The vast majority of Jews around the world feel a connection or kinship with Israel, whether or not they explicitly identify as Zionists, and regardless of their opinions and the policies of the Israeli government. While there has been a continuous Jewish presence in the land of Israel over the millennia, the yearning to return to Zion, the biblical term for both the land of Israel and Jerusalem, has been a cornerstone of Jewish communal life since the Romans violently colonized the land, sending Jews into exile 2,000 years ago. That is a really great write-up. But, as you heard, that's not how Webster's defines it. Webster's currently calls it an international movement originally for the establishment of a Jewish national or religious community in Palestine, and later for the support of modern Israel. Saying in Palestine is a huge problem and inaccurate. It somehow treats Palestine as the beginning. Israel predates Palestine. And as you heard, the Times-Union also said born in the 19th century. So they are defining it based on when a group of Jewish people who were living in Europe started using the term. You, as a news consumer, get the wrong idea that it's something that just started in the 1800s. If Lysistrata was about feminism, then Zionism dates back thousands of years too. Throughout all this time, members of the people of Judea, people of Israel, people of Zion have been trying to get back home and have self-determination. People who want to deny history invented an imaginary reality in which the whole concept of living in Israel is just some European project designed by quote-unquote white people. Everything about that is wrong. One of my favorite people online is Ashager Araro. She is Ethiopian Israeli. She has this video up on Instagram, which I will include in my newsletter.
When you describe Zionism as this white imperialist idea, you actively delete the history of Black and brown Jews. You dismiss our stories, struggle, and survival. You ignore the fact that the Zionist cause have built a safe home for Jews like us.
Activist groups on the far left want this. They want you to believe that it's some sort of European white colonialist project thing, which is false. And by the way, they're also wrong even within that argument. That's such a modern American prism for viewing another society's history. Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, whichever term you use, in Europe were very much not considered white. And even by today's progressive standards, lots of Europeans are not white, but progressive groups keep trying to call Europeans white, and that's even wrong within their own terminology. It's such a mess. I'm going to try to put this in terms that progressives could understand. All right. Maybe that's you, or maybe it's someone you know. You can share this with them. Here goes. Your Eurocentrism erases the lived experiences of people of color in subjugated minority communities across the globe who have had to live for centuries under oppression and colonialist paradigms. This is some sound I recorded at the awesome Rally Against Anti-Semitism in Washington, D.C. in November 2023. This was a great Israeli singer named Omer Adam. There were close to 300,000 people, no acts of violence, no one burning American flags, no one attacking each other. It was love and peace and joy. It was wonderful. I held this big sign that had two sides on it. One of them was this design that I made. You can see it online. I'll put it in my newsletter. The other one said this: about 50 Muslim nations, one tiny Jewish nation, rejecting only Israel, anti-Zionism, is anti-Semitism, duh. It's so obvious once you come to understand what this term actually means. Now let's look at the journalistic principle here. If news editors are willing to ignore Webster's when it comes to transgenderism, because they understand what that term has come to mean, then they don't strictly go by the dictionary. But when it comes to Zionism, they like to. Here, they use it. So we need two things. We need the folks who put together these dictionaries to update their definitions so that it's clear Zionism is the longing to return to a free land with self-determination in Israel, or you could say in Zion. That would be accurate based on the ways we use it. And if the dictionaries don't get caught up, well, just as news editors are willing to ignore Webster's when it comes to transgenderism, they're avoiding that term, even though it's right there in Webster's, not listed as being problematic, then they should start listening to people like us who tell them what this term really means. Coming up, media failures around one pro-terror radical. It's my birthday. As I record this, I have just finished celebrating the day. In recent years, I've tried to get better about appreciating, because who knows how many we get. If you want to celebrate, show appreciation, there are a bunch of things you can do. First, the current levels for becoming a paid subscriber or a founding member of my newsletter include the number 18 in them. That's because of the significance of the number 18. I've written about that online. Just go to the newsletter. You can also make a contribution to this show through the website, joshlebs.com. And I have merch as thank yous, so just let me know if you want some. Also, you can rate and review this show. I see the individual name of each person who becomes a paid subscriber or founding member or makes a contribution. And I see when people rate and review this show, you will get a direct thank you from me. A lot of you have been asking me about the case of one pro-terror radical from Columbia University, Mahmoud Khalil. The media has gone wild over this story, and they are blowing it. I've told you when it comes to a lot of the Trump stuff, Rachel Maddow on MSNBC does a fantastic job of calling him out. But her network, MSNBC, very often misses crucial basics when it comes to anything involving Israel. Here is something Rachel said about this.
Yesterday, a federal judge blocked Trump from deporting a young man who is a lawful permanent resident of this country. He has a green card. Trump sent immigration agents to arrest him, and they said they were taking away his green card, revoking his legal status in this country because he has been an outspoken critic of the war in Gaza.
No, this is a myth that the media has been pushing. This is not about criticism. So many people are freaking out about this one case, saying it's an attack on freedom of speech and that green card holders are supposed to have First Amendment rights, so that this is all about Trump violating those rights. I watched, listened to, and read a bunch of different reports about this one guy. And after all that, I went and looked up the law. Okay, that right there tells you a lot. I had to go look it up. It talks about people who can get green cards and people who cannot get green cards, and this would include having your green card taken away. And I'll put this in the newsletter so you can see it. It specifically says if you are a representative of a political, social, or other group that endorses or espouses terrorist activity, you don't even have to be part of a group. If you endorse or espouse terrorist activity or persuade others to endorse or espouse terrorist activity or support a terrorist organization. Based on everything that I've seen, this guy has very clearly been doing that. Supporting Hamas, distributing information in support of Hamas, encouraging people to support terrorism. There should be zero reports that leave out this information. Now, if you have a problem with the law and you want people with green cards to be allowed to support terrorism, then encourage people to support terrorism, well, go fight to change the law. Trump is doing so many horrible things. People on the left don't need to create fake ones. This guy's case will be adjudicated. All right. Maybe somehow his lawyers will successfully argue that he did not do those things, or maybe they'll get this part of the law shot down. But making this guy a cause célèbre is insane. There are people who are immigrants who have spoken out against him. One of them is a former Miss Iraq who became a U.S. citizen and joined the U.S. military, Sarah Edan. She posted a video about this guy. She said, getting a green card is the dream for so many people around the world.
You think that you can support our enemies and harass American citizens on college campuses, publicly say that you support the people who sworn the death to America? Of course you'll get deported. I have zero sympathy for him. And by the way, he's an Arab. Do you know what would happen to him if he did this in any Arab country? No, he would not get deported. He will be imprisoned and maybe a life sentence. Maybe he will be treated like the Hamas terrorists that they are.
This also gets at another important issue I've talked about in the past, which is this whole idea of people rushing to have quote unquote opinions about everything. It's an ethical responsibility to first gather information and learn all this stuff. It's supposed to be the media providing that. So when people hear reports, they're supposed to be able to trust that that's what they need to know in order to have an informed opinion. But they're not getting that. And the same thing is happening right now as I record this, because Israel has launched a new military action in Gaza. All these people are, of course, rushing to scream what they always scream, stuff like genocide, which is so obviously not what's happening. They have not learned their lessons about how you have to gather information first. For example, what Hamas has been up to. How about how, after all this time, Hamas is still holding on to, starving, and abusing hostages? When the people who were attacked have their military fight back, the world flips out at them. And I'm keeping an eye on the coverage. So far, it's not looking good. I'll be bringing you more of that next week, plus more on this one guy from Columbia University, and so much more. Media failures are keeping me busy. That was a tragicomic laugh. As always, thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear from you. The best way to get in touch with me is to be a paid subscriber to the newsletter. You can message me directly or submit information in comments. That's always the first place I check. And for anyone, there's a form you can fill out at my website, joshlevs.com. I look forward to hearing from you, and I will see you next week.